My name is Christine Marsh. I'm 41 years old. 8 months after my father died, a woman from my bank's fraud department called to ask if I'd recently cashed a joint insurance check for $45,000, made out to me and my sister. I told her I hadn't. I hadn't even known a check like that existed. She asked if I could come in to review a signature on file, because the one on the deposit didn't match anything else in my banking history. It matched my sister's handwriting almost perfectly. Almost. What I didn't know yet, sitting in that parking lot with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, was how long she'd been planning it, or how many other things from our father's estate had quietly disappeared the exact same way, one signature at a time. My father, Walter, was a mechanic for 38 years, the kind of man who fixed things because he genuinely liked understanding how they worked, not because he had to. He raised my sister Karen and me mostly on his own after our mother left when I was 9 and Karen was 7, not because he wanted to be a single father, but because he was the one who stayed, and staying, in his mind, wasn't a choice you got credit for. It was just what you did. He wasn't an emotionally expressive man, not in the way people talk about now, but he showed up for everything. Every school event, every dentist appointment, every disaster with a car in his driveway that belonged to some neighbor who couldn't afford a real mechanic. He worked long hours and came home tired and made dinner anyway, most nights, because he didn't believe in ordering out when there was food in the fridge and time to cook it, even if that time came at 10 at night after a double shift. Karen and I grew up close in the specific way siblings do when they're raised by one exhausted, loving parent instead of two. We fought over small things and depended on each other for bigger ones, and for most of our childhood, I would have told you Karen was the person I trusted most in the world after our father. I remember specific things from those years that, looking back now, I hold differently than I once did. Karen walking me to school every morning for 2 years after our mother left, holding my hand the entire way even though she was barely old enough to be reliable for that herself. The two of us splitting the same bedroom for most of our childhood because our father's house only had 2, whispering to each other after lights out about which parent-teacher conference had gone well and which hadn't, which of us had gotten in trouble that week and why. Karen covering for me, more than once, when I snuck out as a teenager, taking the blame herself rather than let our father find out how often I'd actually been doing it. That trust is important to understand, because it's the exact thing that made what happened possible. My father passed away 2 years ago, from a heart attack that gave none of us any warning at all, no long illness, no chance to prepare, just a phone call on an ordinary Thursday that changed everything in the space of one sentence. He was 68. He'd worked right up until the week before, still fixing things, still showing up. In the chaos of the weeks after his funeral, Karen offered to handle most of the estate paperwork, the funeral costs, the small savings account, the modest life insurance policy he'd carried through his union for decades. I was grateful for the offer at the time. I was working through my own grief in a way that made paperwork feel impossible, and Karen seemed to want to be useful, to have something concrete to do with her hands while the rest of us were simply trying to get through each day. "I've got this," she told me, at the funeral home, holding a folder of documents I hadn't even known existed yet. "You don't need to worry about any of it. I'll keep you updated." I believed her completely. Karen had always been the more organized one between us, the one who remembered appointment dates, who kept receipts, who could find any document in under a minute in a filing system only she fully understood. Handing her the estate paperwork felt like handing it to exactly the right person. Our father's will was simple and unambiguous, everything split evenly between the two of us, down to the dollar, a fact he'd told us both, separately, more than once over the years, usually with the same joke attached: "I don't play favorites, girls, don't make me start now." The life insurance policy, I later learned, was structured the same way, a joint payout requiring both our signatures to process, specifically because he'd wanted to avoid exactly the kind of unequal distribution that sometimes happens when families divide things up informally. I never once thought to ask Karen for copies of anything. I trusted her the same way I'd trusted her my whole life, completely, without a second thought, the way you trust a sister who helped raise you as much as your exhausted single father did. To understand how completely I trusted her, you have to understand what Karen was like growing up, and what she became as an adult, at least on the surface of things. She was the sibling who remembered everyone's birthdays without needing a reminder. The one who organized our father's 60th birthday party down to the last detail, who drove 2 hours each way every other weekend during his final years just to check in on him, who called him every Sunday evening without fail, the way our mother never had. She married Doug, a genuinely decent, hard-working man, when she was 26, and they built what looked, from the outside, like a stable, comfortable life, 2 kids, a modest house in a good school district, steady jobs, the kind of ordinary happiness that doesn't draw much attention because it isn't dramatic. What I didn't fully appreciate, until much later, was the quiet financial strain running underneath that stability. Doug's company had gone through a rocky stretch 2 years before our father's death, cutting his hours for the better part of a year before things stabilized. Karen never mentioned this to me in any detail at the time, a passing comment here and there about things being a little tight, nothing that registered as urgent, nothing that suggested the kind of pressure that might, eventually, lead someone to make the choice she ultimately made. I think about that strain now and try to hold 2 things true at once, because I believe they both are, that financial pressure doesn't excuse forgery, and that understanding where it came from helps explain, even if it doesn't justify, how my sister arrived at a decision I never would have believed her capable of making. Looking back now, there were signs earlier than the fraud department's call, small enough at the time that I explained each one away without much difficulty. About 4 months after the funeral, Karen mentioned, in passing, that she'd put a new roof on her house, a substantial expense, tens of thousands of dollars, that she described as coming from some savings and a home equity loan. I didn't question it. Karen had always been financially careful, and a roof was the kind of ordinary homeowner expense that didn't require explanation. A month after that, she told me she and her husband, Doug, were taking their kids to Disney World over spring break, a trip she described as something we'd been saving for forever, though I couldn't remember her ever mentioning saving for it before our father's death. Around the same time, she casually mentioned paying off Doug's truck loan early, just to simplify things, in a tone that suggested this was a minor housekeeping detail rather than the kind of expense that would have required real financial planning 6 months earlier. Individually, none of these things alarmed me. Karen and Doug both worked steady jobs. People take on home equity loans. People save for vacations. I had no specific reason, in any single instance, to connect these expenses to our father's estate, and I want to be honest that I didn't go looking for a connection, because it never once occurred to me that there might be one to find. It was only much later, once I understood the full timeline, that I could see how precisely each of these purchases lined up with money that should have been mine, half of it, by both a legal will and a father's explicit, repeated intention. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was sitting in the parking lot of my daughter's dance studio, waiting for her lesson to end. The woman identified herself as being with my bank's fraud department, her voice careful and procedural in the way that immediately puts you on edge before you even understand why. She asked if I could confirm whether I'd recently deposited a life insurance check for $45,000, made jointly payable to Christine Marsh and Karen Whitfield. I told her I hadn't deposited anything. I told her I didn't even know a check for that amount existed. I'd assumed, based on what little Karen had told me, that the insurance payout was smaller, still being processed, still working its way through the paperwork Karen had assured me she was handling. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment. "The check was deposited 5 months ago," she said. "Both signatures are on it. We flag joint payee checks periodically for verification, especially with larger amounts, and something about the signature pattern on this one got kicked up for review internally. I wanted to confirm with you directly before we proceed." I asked her to describe the signature. She read it back to me carefully, spelling out the shape of it, the loop on the C, the way the last name trailed off at the end, details specific enough that I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, that whoever had signed this had studied my actual signature closely before attempting it. It was close, closer than I would have expected from anyone but me. But it wasn't mine. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't seen a check. I hadn't been told, in 5 months, that a $45,000 payout had even been issued. "Do you want to file a formal dispute?" the woman asked. If the signature isn't yours, we'd need to open an investigation, which could involve law enforcement depending on what we find. I want to make sure you understand that before you decide anything. I told her I needed a little time to think, and she gave me her direct line, along with a case number I wrote down with a shaking hand on the back of a dance studio flyer, the only paper I had within reach. I remember staring at that case number for a long time after we hung up, an ordinary string of digits that had just turned my entire understanding of my sister into something I no longer recognized. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up, watching other parents walk in and out of the dance studio with their ordinary Tuesday afternoons intact, while mine had just come apart in a way I didn't yet have words for. I drove home in a kind of fog, and once my daughter was settled with her homework, I sat down at my kitchen table and started doing the math I'd been avoiding for months without realizing I was avoiding it. The check had been deposited 5 months earlier, about 3 months after our father's death. 6 weeks after that, Karen mentioned the new roof. A month after the roof, the Disney World trip. Around the same window, the truck loan paid off early. I pulled out my phone and looked back through old text messages between us, searching for any mention of the insurance policy, any update Karen had promised and never quite delivered. I found exactly what I expected to find, a string of my own messages, spaced out over months, asking gently how the estate paperwork was coming along, and Karen's replies, each one some version of "still working through it, insurance takes forever" or "almost done, I'll fill you in soon." She had told me, in writing, at least 4 separate times, that the insurance was still being processed, during a period when the check had already been deposited, cashed, and spent on a roof, a vacation, and a truck loan. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, rereading those messages, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood my sister, my closest ally for 39 years, the person I would have said, without hesitation, I trusted more than almost anyone alive. 2 days after the fraud department's call, I went into the bank in person, partly because I wanted to see the actual check with my own eyes before I said a single word to Karen. A branch manager pulled up the imaging system and printed a copy for me, the front of the check, the back with both endorsements, mine forged in that careful, close approximation, and Karen's, genuine, confident, unhurried. I stood at the counter holding that printout for a long moment, comparing the 2 signatures side by side, my own real one from an old bank form beside the forgery. "It's a good forgery," the branch manager said, not unkindly, almost professionally, the way I imagine someone in her position learns to say difficult things without unnecessary cruelty. "Whoever did this clearly practiced. Most forgeries we catch are much cruder than this." I asked her what would happen next if I confirmed the signature wasn't mine. She walked me through it plainly: a formal fraud claim, an internal investigation, likely restitution from the bank's insurance in the short term while they pursued the responsible party, and, depending on what I wanted, the option to involve law enforcement given that forgery of this kind is a felony in our state, regardless of the relationship between the parties involved. I left that meeting with the printed check in a folder in my bag, the physical proof I would carry into the coffee shop 3 days later, though in the end, I never had to take it out. Karen didn't ask to see it. I think some part of her already knew exactly what it would show. I didn't call Karen that night. I want to be honest about what I did instead, because I think it matters. I went into my father's old toolbox, which I'd kept in my garage since the funeral, unable to give it away or even fully sort through it. I sat on the garage floor and opened it, running my hands over tools he'd used for decades, still faintly smelling of motor oil and the specific dust of his workshop. I thought about his joke, "I don't play favorites, girls, don't make me start now," and how deliberately he'd structured his will and his insurance policy specifically to prevent this exact outcome, specifically because he must have understood, on some level, that money divided informally between siblings doesn't always divide fairly, even between siblings who love each other. I thought about every family gathering over the past 2 years where Karen had sat across from me, easily, warmly, talking about her new roof or her kids' trip to Disney World, while I nodded along, genuinely happy for her, having no idea I was looking at my own father's money spent in front of me, described as her own savings. I cried harder that night than I had at the funeral itself, And I think it was for the same reason I'd later hear echoed in other people's stories like mine. The funeral had been a clean loss, devastating but honest. This was a second loss, layered on top of the first, quieter and somehow crueler, because it meant I'd spent 2 years grieving my father next to a sister who was actively, methodically taking something from me while I wasn't looking, and doing it well enough that I never once suspected. I sat on that garage floor until close to midnight, holding one of my father's wrenches, before I finally went inside. I told my husband, Marcus, everything the next morning, and watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something harder as I laid out the timeline piece by piece. "You need to report this," he said, once I'd finished. "This isn't a family disagreement, Christine. This is forgery. This is fraud. She committed an actual crime." I told him I wasn't ready to think about it in those terms yet. Some part of me was still holding out hope for an explanation that would make this make sense without requiring me to think of my sister as someone capable of forging my name on a check. What explanation would make this okay? Marcus asked, gently but directly. Genuinely, I want to know, because I can't think of one myself. I couldn't think of one either. I sat with that silence for a long moment before admitting, out loud, that I didn't think there was one, that the version of Karen who had done this wasn't a version I recognized, but the evidence didn't leave much room for a kinder interpretation. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I told him I needed to talk to her directly first, before I decided anything else. I needed to hear what she'd say when she knew I'd found out, even if I already suspected it wouldn't change the facts. I asked Karen to meet me at a coffee shop, the same way I'd later learn a lot of people in situations like mine instinctively choose neutral, public ground for these conversations, some unconscious understanding that home turf makes it too easy for old family dynamics to take over the room. She arrived looking entirely normal, entirely unaware of what was coming, and I remember feeling a strange, cold clarity watching her sit down across from me, order her coffee, ask casually how my week had been. I didn't ease into it. I laid it out plainly. The fraud department's call. The signature. The timeline, the roof, the Disney trip, the truck loan, all lined up precisely against a check that had been deposited 5 months earlier while she was telling me, in writing, that the insurance was still being processed. Karen's face went through several expressions in quick succession. I watched her calculate, in real time, whether denial was still an option, before something in her posture seemed to give up on that idea entirely. "I was going to pay you back," she said. "I just needed some time. Doug's job situation was rough last year, and the roof genuinely couldn't wait, and I told myself I'd figure out how to make it right before you ever needed to know the details." "You forged my signature, Karen," I said. "That's not a loan. That's not borrowing against something with the intention of paying it back. That's a felony you committed against your own sister, and you did it while lying to my face for 5 months about what was even happening with Dad's estate." "I didn't think of it like that," she said, and I believe, even now, that she meant it, that somewhere in the specific reasoning she'd built for herself, she'd genuinely convinced herself this was closer to borrowing than stealing, a temporary imbalance rather than a permanent theft. "How did you even do it?" I asked. "The signature. How did you make it close enough to pass?" She looked down at her coffee. "I practiced," she said quietly. "For a while. I had old cards you'd signed, birthday cards, things like that. I practiced until it looked close enough." Hearing her describe practicing my signature, deliberately, methodically, until it was convincing enough to pass a bank's initial review, was somehow worse than the theft itself. It meant this hadn't been an impulsive decision made in a moment of financial desperation. It had been planned, rehearsed, executed with intention over what must have been days or weeks before she ever walked into that bank. "How long did you practice?" I asked, needing to know the full shape of it, even as each answer made it harder to hear. "A couple weeks," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I told myself I'd stop if it didn't look right. I told myself if I couldn't get it close, that would be a sign not to do it. And then I got it close, and I didn't stop. "Did you think about what would happen if I found out?" I told myself I'd have paid you back by then, she said. I told myself it would just look like I'd handled the estate a little slowly, and that I'd make it right before it ever became a problem. I know how that sounds now. I knew, even then, on some level, how it would sound if you ever heard me say it out loud like this. You lied to me every single time I asked about the estate, I said. For 5 months. Not once, not in a moment of panic, over and over, deliberately, every time I brought it up. She didn't argue with that. She just nodded, still not looking at me, turning her coffee cup slightly on the table between us the way I would later notice was a habit she and my mother apparently shared, though our mother had been gone from our lives too long for Karen to have consciously learned it from her. I asked her, directly, why she hadn't simply come to me and asked for help, or asked to borrow against her share early, or told me honestly that she and Doug were struggling and needed support faster than the estate process was moving. She was quiet for a long time before answering. Because I knew you'd say yes, she said finally, and I didn't want to owe you that. I didn't want to be the sister who always needs help. I've felt like that my whole life, Christine. You were always the more put-together one, the one who had things figured out, and I wanted, for once, to solve my own problem without asking. So instead you solved it by stealing from me, I said. That's not independence, Karen. That's just theft with a story attached to make it feel better. She didn't have an answer to that. I don't think there was one that would have actually held up, and I think some part of her knew it too, sitting across from me in that coffee shop, out of excuses for the first time in 5 months. I want to be honest that I sat with the question of whether to report her to the police for longer than I expected to. Marcus was right that what she'd done was a genuine crime, not a gray area, not a judgment call like some of the smaller family unfairnesses I'd absorbed over the years without ever naming them. This was forgery. This was bank fraud. A prosecutor would have had an easy case. The lawyer I consulted, a woman named Renata who specialized in estate and financial disputes, laid out my options with the kind of clear, unemotional precision I badly needed at that point, after days of feeling like my thoughts were moving in circles. She explained that forgery of a negotiable instrument, combined with the deposit of a fraudulently endorsed check, would likely qualify as a felony in our state, carrying real potential for prison time depending on prior record and how aggressively a prosecutor chose to pursue it. She also explained the civil path, a straightforward claim for the funds, backed by the bank's own fraud investigation and signature analysis, that would almost certainly succeed regardless of whether I pursued criminal charges alongside it. You don't have to decide both paths at once, Renata told me. Some clients pursue civil recovery first and hold criminal referral as leverage, in writing, as part of a settlement. It's not uncommon in family situations like this one, where the person genuinely wants the money back more than they want their sibling in prison, but still wants real consequences attached to the agreement. That framework helped me more than I expected it to. It gave me language for what I actually wanted, which wasn't Karen's imprisonment, and wasn't quite forgiveness either. It was something in between, a consequence serious enough to be real, structured formally enough that it couldn't be quietly forgotten the way so many smaller unfairnesses in families tend to be. I also thought about her kids, my niece and nephew, who I loved, who had nothing to do with any of this, who would carry the weight of watching their mother face criminal charges brought by her own sister, for the rest of their lives, regardless of how justified those charges were. I consulted a lawyer, mostly to understand my actual options rather than because I'd already decided against pressing charges. She confirmed I had a strong case, both criminally and civilly, and laid out clearly what each path would involve, the timeline, the likely outcomes, the toll either route would take on the family regardless of which one I chose. In the end, I chose a middle path, one I'm not sure was right, but one I could live with. I gave Karen a deadline, 6 months to repay my full share of the $45,000, documented in a formal written agreement drafted by my lawyer, with the explicit understanding that failure to comply would result in both criminal and civil action, no further warnings, no further flexibility. This isn't forgiveness, I told her, when I handed her the agreement. This is me deciding not to destroy your life over this, for your kids' sake more than yours. But I need you to understand that if you miss even one payment, I will pursue this fully, and I won't hesitate the way I'm choosing not to hesitate right now." She signed it without argument. Karen and Doug sold their truck, the same one whose loan she'd paid off early with my portion of the insurance money, within a month of signing the agreement, and used the proceeds toward the first payment. They took out a second mortgage on the house to cover a larger portion. It took them just under 5 months, slightly ahead of the deadline, to repay the full amount, in installments I tracked carefully alongside my lawyer, each payment documented, each one landing exactly when it was supposed to. I didn't celebrate when the final payment came through. It didn't feel like a victory in any satisfying sense. It felt more like the closing of a wound that had needed stitches for a long time, necessary, overdue, but not something that erased the fact that the wound had happened in the first place. Doug, my brother-in-law, called me once during that period, apologetically, to say he hadn't known where the roof money or the truck payoff had actually come from until I confronted Karen. I believed him. I don't think Karen had told him the truth any more than she'd told me. I kept a spreadsheet during those 5 months, something Renata had recommended, tracking each payment against the agreed schedule, date received, amount, running balance, method of payment. It felt strange, at first, to reduce my relationship with my own sister to a spreadsheet, something so clinical and precise applied to a person I'd shared a childhood bedroom with. But I found, over time, that the spreadsheet gave me something I badly needed during those months, a way to measure whether Karen was actually keeping her word that didn't rely on my feelings about her in any given week, which shifted constantly, from anger to grief to a strange, lingering tenderness I couldn't quite let go of even after everything. Every payment that landed on time felt like a small, quiet piece of evidence, not that everything was fixed, but that this particular promise, unlike the 5 months of promises before it, was actually being kept. My father's sister, my Aunt Patricia, found out about what happened almost by accident, when she asked, at a family gathering, why Karen and Doug had sold their truck so soon after buying it. I told her the truth, plainly, the same way I'd told my daughter later, not out of a desire to punish Karen socially, but because I was tired of managing everyone else's comfort around a truth that had cost me significantly more than comfort. Patricia was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Your father would have been heartbroken," she said finally. Not about the money. About what it means that she felt like she had to do it that way instead of just asking one of us for help. I told her I'd thought the same thing, more than once, in the months since. "Are you going to tell the rest of the family?" she asked. "I'm not going to hide it," I said. "But I'm also not going to make it my job to announce it to everyone. If people ask, I'll tell them the truth. I'm just not doing the work of protecting her reputation anymore, the way I might have automatically done before all this." Patricia nodded slowly. "That seems fair," she said. "More than fair, honestly, given what she did." Word did spread, eventually, the way it tends to in families, in the quiet, second-hand way that doesn't require any single person to have made an announcement. Karen never mentioned it to me directly, but I noticed, at the next few family gatherings, a different quality to how people spoke to her, not cruel, not confrontational, just slightly more careful, the way people get around someone whose reliability has been publicly, if quietly, called into question. My relationship with Karen today is different than it was before any of this happened, in ways that go beyond the money itself. We still speak. We're still, in some limited sense, sisters who show up for each other at family events, who exchange birthday cards, who maintain the outer shape of the relationship we always had. But something underneath that shape changed permanently the day I sat in that coffee shop and watched her admit to practicing my signature on old birthday cards until it was convincing enough to pass. I don't think I'll ever fully trust her with anything that matters again, not in the automatic, unquestioning way I once did. I don't think that's cruelty on my part. I think it's just an honest accounting of what actually happened, held on to rather than smoothed over the way families so often smooth these things over, in the name of keeping the peace. I think about my father a lot in the context of all this, how deliberately he structured his will and his insurance policy to prevent exactly this outcome, how his joke about not playing favorites turned out to be less of a joke and more of a quiet, specific worry he'd carried for years without ever saying so directly. I think, if he'd known what would happen, he would have been devastated, not by the money, but by what it revealed about the daughter he'd raised, the one he'd trusted completely, the same way I once had. My daughter, Lily, is 12, old enough to notice that something had shifted between me and her Aunt Karen, even before I explained why. She asked me directly, one evening, why we didn't see Karen's family as often as we used to. I told her the truth, in a version I thought a 12-year-old could hold honestly without being frightened by it, that Aunt Karen had taken something from me after Grandpa died, something that wasn't hers to take, and that it had taken a long time to fix, and that fixing it had changed how much I trusted her, even though we still loved each other. "Would you ever do that to me?" Lily asked, which surprised me, though I understood, on reflection, exactly why a child would ask that question after hearing a story like this one. "No," I told her. "And if I ever did something that wrong to someone I loved, I'd want them to tell me the truth about it, the way I finally told Aunt Karen, instead of just letting it go quietly. That's not the mean thing to do. It's actually the more honest, more caring thing to do, even when it doesn't feel that way in the moment." She thought about that for a while, the way kids do when they're turning something over more carefully than adults sometimes give them credit for. "I'm glad you told the truth," she said finally. "Even if it was hard." I work as a project coordinator for a mid-sized construction firm, a job that mostly runs on trust between people who sign off on each other's paperwork constantly, contractors and subcontractors and vendors all relying on each other's word backed up by documentation. I hadn't realized, until this happened to me personally, how much of my professional life was built on exactly the kind of trust Karen had exploited, and how differently I'd started looking at it. About a month after the repayment agreement was signed, a colleague of mine, Denise, who I'd confided in loosely during the worst of it, asked how I was holding up. "Honestly, it's changed how I look at paperwork everywhere," I told her. "Not just with Karen. I find myself double-checking things at work now that I never used to think twice about. Signatures. Authorizations. I used to think that kind of carefulness was almost insulting to the people you worked with. Now I just think of it as normal diligence." Denise nodded slowly. "I think that happens to everyone who goes through something like this," she said. "It doesn't mean you don't trust people anymore. It just means you understand now that trust and verification aren't actually opposites. You can have both." I've thought about that conversation more than once since. I think it captured something I hadn't quite articulated to myself yet, that the version of trust one extended to Karen before all this wasn't really trust in the healthiest sense. It was closer to assumption, an absence of curiosity dressed up as faith in someone I loved. Real trust, I've come to believe, can survive a few reasonable questions along the way. What I had with Karen couldn't survive even one. People who hear this story often expect me to say I cut Karen off completely, that this was the clean, dramatic ending to a sibling relationship destroyed by betrayal. It wasn't, and I think it's more honest to say so plainly, even though the neater version might make for a more satisfying story. What happened instead was something slower and harder to summarize. I learned that even the people who helped raise you, who shared a childhood with you, who you'd trust without a second thought, are capable of decisions you never would have predicted, made under pressures you may never fully understand, using methods that can be genuinely shocking once you see them clearly. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me, in the aftermath of losing my father, was the grief itself, the specific, hollow ache of his absence from ordinary days. I've since learned there's something that can compound even that grief, discovering that someone you loved used your father's death, and your own trust, as an opportunity, quietly, methodically, while telling you to your face that everything was still being handled. I don't think Karen set out, in the raw weeks after our father's funeral, to become someone who forges signatures. I think she made one decision, under financial pressure, that felt survivable and temporary in the moment, and then had to keep making it, again and again, every time I asked how the estate paperwork was coming along, until the lie had grown large enough that undoing it honestly must have felt impossible from the inside. That doesn't excuse what she did. But it helps me understand it, which is different, and which is the only way I've found to keep something resembling a relationship with my sister without pretending the last 2 years didn't happen exactly the way they did. I still have my father's toolbox in my garage. I didn't give it to Karen, and she never asked for it, which I think, in its own quiet way, told me something about how she understood what had happened between us, even without either of us saying it directly. Sometimes, on hard days, I go out and sit with it the way I did the night I first pieced everything together. I run my hands over the same tools, still faintly smelling of motor oil after 2 years, and I think about his joke, "I don't play favorites, girls, don't make me start now," and how much care he must have put into making sure that joke stayed true, structuring his will and his policy so specifically that it would have taken deliberate fraud, not oversight, to undo what he intended. I think he'd be proud, in the end, that I found out the truth and did something honest with it, even if the path I chose wasn't the harshest one available to me. I think he raised both of us to value fairness, and I think, somewhere underneath everything that happened, Karen valued it too, even when she made choices that betrayed it as badly as she did. The first Thanksgiving after the repayment agreement was signed, our whole extended family gathered at my Aunt Patricia's house, the way we had every year since our father passed, since none of us wanted to lose that tradition along with everything else. Karen and I hadn't spent real time in the same room since the coffee shop, beyond the brief, careful interactions required at a cousin's graduation earlier that fall. I remember standing in Patricia's kitchen, helping set the table, when Karen came in to grab serving spoons and we ended up alone together for the first time in months. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Karen set down the spoons and said, quietly, "I know sorry doesn't undo it. I'm not going to pretend it does. But I am sorry, Christine. Not just for the money. For making you doubt whether you could ever trust me again. I think that's the part one did that I can't actually fix, no matter how much I pay back." It was the first time she'd said something that didn't sound like an explanation or a justification, just a plain acknowledgement of the specific damage that no repayment plan could touch. "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were before. I think I've made peace with that. But I don't want you to think I've written you off completely either. I just need this to keep being real, for a long time, before I'll believe it's real at all." She nodded, and we finished setting the table together, not quite like sisters who'd never been through any of this, but like two people slowly, carefully, rebuilding something neither of us was willing to fully give up on yet. A few weeks after that Thanksgiving conversation, I drove out to the cemetery alone, the way I try to a few times a year, and sat on the grass beside my father's headstone with his old watch on my wrist. I told him everything, out loud, the way I imagine a lot of people do at gravesites even when they're not sure anyone is listening: the check, the fraud department's call, the forgery, the coffee shop, the repayment agreement, the spreadsheet, the slow, careful thaw with Karen that was still ongoing, still uncertain, still more work than resolution. "You tried so hard to make sure this couldn't happen," I told him, turning the watch on my wrist. "The will, the joint signatures on the policy, all of it. I don't think you ever imagined it would take actual forgery to get around what you built. I think that would have broken your heart more than anything else about this." I sat there for a long time, the way I had at that cemetery more times than I could count over the past 2 years, and I thought about how much of what my father left behind wasn't really the money at all, it was the specific, deliberate care he'd put into trying to protect both his daughters equally, even from each other, even from a version of one of us he never got to meet, the version capable of practicing a signature on old birthday cards until it was close enough to pass. I don't know if he'd be more devastated by what Karen did or more proud of how I chose to handle it once I found out. I like to think, if he could see all of it clearly, he'd understand both feelings could be true at the same time, the way so much of this story has turned out to require holding two true things at once instead of choosing a simpler, cleaner version that never really existed in the first place. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I didn't expect to learn at 41 years old, from my own sister, of all people. Trust, even trust built over an entire shared childhood, isn't a guarantee against betrayal. It's just a starting point, one that has to be able to survive contact with real pressure, real temptation, real opportunity, and sometimes, even with people who love you, it doesn't. I don't regret trusting Karen with my father's estate in the first place. I think trusting the people closest to you is still the right instinct, even when it occasionally gets exploited. What I regret is not asking more questions sooner, not requesting documentation as a matter of course rather than an accusation, treating "I've got this" as a complete answer rather than the beginning of a conversation that should have continued with real transparency attached. I've thought, too, about what I'd say now to anyone handling an estate with a sibling, based on everything I learned the hard way. Ask for documentation early, not because you suspect anything, but because clear records protect everyone, including the person managing things, from exactly this kind of situation spiraling the way ours did. A request for transparency isn't an accusation. It's just good practice, the same way Renata described trust and verification as two things that can coexist rather than contradict each other. I wish someone had told me that plainly, 2 years ago, before any of this happened, instead of learning it the way I did. I wear my father's old watch now, the one he wore every day at the shop, the one Karen and I agreed, easily, without any conflict at all, should go to me because I was the one who used to ask him how it worked when I was small. It still runs a little fast, the way it always did, and every time I check it, I think about how deliberately he tried to build fairness into everything he left behind, and how much work it took, in the end, to make sure that fairness actually held. If you've ever discovered a betrayal from someone you trusted completely, someone who helped raise you or grew up alongside you, I'd love to hear how you found out, and what you decided to do once you knew. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.